coming out today. I'm Jen Riccardi. I do trade policy on behalf of the European Union at their embassy in Washington, D.C. And the EU has been coming to South by since 2018, I think was our first year here. And we've hosted a lot of interesting people and speakers over time. And I would get kicked out of the embassy by my ambassador if I did not note that the EU is the biggest trading partner, a huge trading partner for Texas, significant amount of money in and out, and the number one source of foreign direct investment. But today, we're here to talk about China national security and the implications for the ICTS supply chain. So the United States and allies, including the European Union, have noted a threat from China in the ICTS supply chain, a question of national and economic security. We are, however, starting to take some divergent paths as to how we address it. In the United States has focused on decoupling and from the Chinese relationship through export controls, investment screenings, prohibitions on importation of certain goods. It gets very complicated in the ICTS supply chain when we're looking at software, code, chips, and a lot of SMEs who might not know how to deal with what's being presented to them. So is this a real threat? And I didn't actually ask my panelists this question before, and I probably should have because they're the experts. But when I was flying in on Saturday, I got a pop-up. A Spanish researcher had discovered a flaw in a Chinese chip called the ESP32 microchip, a processor in over 1 billion devices. She discovered a hidden backdoor in the chip. So 1 billion devices out there have a way for other people to access them. What does that mean? Is the U.S. right in prohibiting certain types of business with China and other countries of concern? So the U.S. Department of Commerce, a good example of how the U.S. is approaching this is with connected vehicles. There was a concern that someone with malice could remotely control your vehicle, could take information that's helpful in a military or other context. And they've banned the prohibition starting next year. They've banned the importation or sale of software and products from China or Russia that can be used in a connected vehicle in this way. So we have an excellent panel here today to discuss this with us. I'm going to start immediately to my left, Dr. Emmet Elazari. She's a founder and CEO of the group Open Policy. She's a cyber expert, and she's currently working to put people like me out of the business of doing policy using AI. In the middle is Joe Merrill, the CEO of Open Teams, an open source AI company based here in Austin. He's an ex-VC, a multi-founder, and according to my panel today, an ex-foreign service officer for the United States in Europe and Asia. And finally, at the end, Wei. She's the executive director of Global Innovation Forum. She's an attorney, a founder, a mentor, and a defender of SMEs and startups all over the globe. So I'm going to turn to Joe and your former State Department experience. Can you give us the U.S. perspective of why China's a threat and what that risk is?
Yeah, when I was in the department, I was very pro-China engagement, and that kind of had been our policy for some time since the 1970s, right? Okay, that Winston Lord, Henry Kissinger policy of engagement, and it had been largely successful. And what happened was Xi Jinping came to power. And there was this, and it was very sudden. People want to nuance this, but it really wasn't nuanced. It was very clear that the direction changed. And when that happened, we were in denial for the longest time that this was really happening. And now, he's openly saying, 2027, I'm going to invade Taiwan. And we're happy to go to war against the United States. And people are still not paying attention. And it's kind of like, he won't do that. And so if you learn anything from this panel, it's that you need to start paying attention to what Xi Jinping says, because he's done everything he said he was going to do. And right now he's saying 2027 are going into Taiwan. And I don't care what the consequences are. And if you weren't paying attention, you should be, because this matters, and it matters a lot.
Thank you. So as I noted up front, the U.S. approach to this perceived risk is an importation ban, which has the effect or could have the effect of completely disrupting supply chains. In fact, some European products might not be able to be sold in the United States as of 2026 because of Chinese ownership of the companies, or partial Chinese ownership. So I would love Amit, as my cyber expert, to weigh in here. The U.S. is taking this prohibition approach to adversarial capital, software, chips, products. Is prohibition the only way of protecting U.S. interests? Can cyber standards be as effective? Are there other tools?
Yeah, excellent question. And I should go on the record that we love you. We don't want to replace you. We had bid open policy, basically our government affairs agent using AI. So we scale access through 99% of the market organizations that don't have necessarily the in-house expertise to participate in policy, but also see what's coming, because actually policy can be opportunity for innovation. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but we are really proud to work with some of the best cyber unicorns in the world. So that's our focus, is kind of empowering actually experts like you show. So you can really focus on this, right? And take a little bit of that, expertise and textual work where we can apply AI and also scale it to a lot of folks that don't have presence in DC. Excellent question. I've been following cyber policy for a while. Before open policy, I was the head of cyber policy into a corporation. So I actually worked a lot on, kind of policies in the space from Europe to China to really measures that are being applied in the US, and also seeing the global perspective and really the evolution in the last 7 years of what has evolved. And so it's pretty clear that we recognize there is tremendous adversarial risk in the supply chain. And that is both from what we call economic supply chain, or, supply chain in terms of component supply, right? And it's that importance, which is part of what we've seen in connected vehicles, but also in AI chips and in others area. And we know there are also vulnerabilities, like real cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Some of them can be malicious, embedded in the hardware, and some of them can be just, vulnerabilities that occur as you are producing code, especially now with AI. A lot of these threat vectors are being elevated. So what we have found is that in the last 3 years or so, we've seen an evolution of cybersecurity regulation. And the top of the spear is actually sometimes motivated by trade issues or national security. But those type of action would tend to say, hey, there are cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and here we need to, kind of ban this entire potential company, entity, or even jurisdiction, right? So there are a lot of approaches there. What I would say is what we have found is absolutely in the cases that we have clear adversarial risk, and I think we saw it with Huawei, right? And we saw it with the network infrastructure. That approach, which could be focused, right, could be helpful. But there are certain areas where the components are so embedded and the risk can be lower because it's mitigated by other protections like in software. And actually, IoT consumer devices is a great example for that, where perhaps banning an entire jurisdiction from the supply chain is not going to be feasible because we don't have alternatives. That's where the cybersecurity measures, things like the EU Cybersecurity Resilience Act, things like the IoT Cyber Trust Mark, which is a label that you can look at to see what security measures the manufacturer, could be a European OEM, it could be a US OEM. They might have Chinese component in the stack, but they can attest and they can show you, verify the type of security measures that they've taken, things like software bill of materials. So we've seen all these cybersecurity standards emerging, and I do believe there is a balance here of taking transparency and better cybersecurity requirements, could be regulated, could be even verified by third parties as a measure for like bulk, right, raising the security baseline, while using the prohibition as a very scalpel, kind of critical measure to be applied where we find that high level risk, like for example, Huawei.
Thank you. That's super. I want to turn to Wall for a minute. So there's myriad rules. There's a big risk of divergence in major markets, including the US and the EU. How might that affect the startup ecosystem?
The divergent markets between the US and the EU. I think the US is more focused on just like outright prohibition, like ban this, export controls, who can invest in you, who can access your technology, and then the EU is a little bit more risk-based approach, depending on the level of security risk. I would say that For startups, it's hard to navigate when there's so many different standards and regulations. The compliance challenges and costs for startups is astronomical. They have very few resources try to navigate and see around the corner. Right now, a lot of risk investors are very hesitant unless you know your regulatory risk and compliance. And I think that's a detriment for the startup ecosystem. I think there's a lot of block mergers and acquisitions, limited access to global markets, and then restricted global partnerships. And so my thought is I like the idea of where the EU is taking more risk-based approach, as I mentioned. So, for example, Sequoia Capital, one of the most renowned institutional investors out there, they had to separate into like the U.S. presence. I think they have a Europe presence. They have a China presence, just to avoid the loss against them investing, in Chinese technologies or U.S. companies doing business with China. So it just makes things more complicated. We know every startup I talk to, every founder, no matter who you are, everyone tells me access to capital is very difficult for them. I think the market access, there's a lot of different regulations, even like data localization requirements. Some countries, for you to do business in that country, you have to physically store your data in that country. There has to be a server physically present there, which can be difficult for startups who might just do a little bit of business in this country, that country. They need servers around the world. There's now some governments are calling for a mandatory disclosure of source code to governments so they can better identify bad actors. But we all know, like, if you're a bad actor, it's very easy to hide your code. Like, it's not going to be there, and the governments are they're not going to be able to identify. If you're a bad actor, you could definitely hide your code. And the threat is that it risks exposing the intellectual property, which is the bread and butter of all the startups' technologies.
All right. So we have a lot of work to do. Joe, what is the risk to innovation when you go further up the supply chain from overly restrictive regulation or divergent regulation?
When you think about regulation, and I'll speak of AI because that's where I have expertise. AI regulation is kind of a joke. I'm going to be very...
Except for the EU's AI Act.
And governments are hopelessly behind because the software is open source. Okay? We know, we make it, right? So if you're using AI on your phone, you're welcome. Because it's all, you can get it for free. And so when you pass a law that says, oh, well, you can't have that. That's like saying you can't have air, you can't have water, right? Anyone can go to GitHub and download it and play around with it and have a good time, right? And so and I might be a little bit overly harsh here on the Biden administration because they put these rules in place and they created like this multi-tier system. And they basically were like, okay, the United States and our 3 closest allies can have whatever they want. And the other NATO members have to go through this labyrinth of rules that is ridiculous, like completely just bonkers. I don't know if anyone can figure it out. And then they have like the 3rd tier, just like, don't give it to these people at all. And so literally it's, okay, all that open source product that anyone can download, no one should be sharing it with any of these people, which is just crazy. And it's just so out of touch, just completely out of touch with what's happening in the market. Now, on the hardware side, it has the same tiers and restrictions, but the tier 3 countries can just replicate this stuff. It's much easier, and so nothing's preventing China from just creating its own NVIDIA replicas and running with them. So what ends up happening is the good players in that 2nd tier that are U.S. allies who are pretty close to bearing the brunt of Russian aggression very, very soon, they can't get their hands on the technology because you have this law that was created by a bunch of people who know nothing about AI, right, who with good intention actually are making it very hard for our European allies to buy Texas-made stuff, which Texas House, like you should care about this, and now tariffs are going to make that even harder because they're going to reciprocate. I'm like, what are we talking about here? This is bonkers because the regulations make no sense whatsoever. And why are we creating impediments to trade within countries that are super friendly and work together?
So I will make an editorial note. Joe was talking about the AI diffusion rule, sort of splits Europe into different tiers of who's worthy of access to restriction-free access to chips. And if you're a startup or a small company wanting to work on AI in Europe, this might affect you because part of Europe's plan to address AI is to create AI superfactories, create supercomputers that small entities can use to help develop and train their own models going forward. And this will change the market dynamics in Europe if the U.S. moves forward with it.
There's even talk right now of prosecuting open source publishers of AI software because they're getting it away to the world. And like, so what are you going to do? You're going to go into Cleveland to this guy who submitted 5 commits on GitHub, and you're going to arrest him because, you know, he helped everybody be able to go to ChatGPT and find out, you know, exactly how many Christmas trees are sold in the U.S. every year. And yet that's where we're at.
So I know that Joe thinks that open source is the way to protect things because it's open source and no one person can control it. The other day, we were talking about cyber once again. And so how realistic is it to develop an international standard of cybersecurity to address these concerns?
Yeah, so I think when we look at policy generally, we have sectorial, and sometimes you have a niche in sectorial, like national security or defense, where you're always going to have sovereign approaches. And this happens in cryptography. This happens in what is applicable to, you know, folks that are selling to federal sectors here and the EU. Sometimes there is some collaboration there. Common criteria is a good example. But then you have all the market. And when we talk about big rocket barriers, what MNCs care about, there's a lot of opportunities in standard collaboration so the policy might take different approaches, risk-based, you have to have third-party certification, etc., fines versus just self-attestation, voluntary. But what we've seen tremendous work towards common specs is it actually the foundation of technical requirements. So again, let's go to an example that is very relatable. We all have potentially, well, maybe not all of us, but I certainly have, like, you know, maybe some smart devices in our home. And so obviously, you know, the smart toasters are a great target for spying. No, just kidding. But they could be leveraged in, you know, botnets, right? So the world has come together to define baseline security measures to what this type of connected device should have. And we actually have a lot of standards collaborations in that space in groups like ISO, right, the international standard organization that adopts European standards. So practically speaking, I think I can assume that about 90%, right, of the general horizontal policies have a lot in mutual. Usually it's ISO standards. It thinks like you should be applying patches, you should have a governance, risk program for your enterprise, etc. And then we can focus on, you know, after we solve that and maybe not achieved full harmonization, but some reciprocity, we can talk about the 10%. And I do want to comment about this question, you know, what are we going to do with AI very briefly, because I do feel like in AI, we're going to have the same type of conversation of finding, okay, where is the point of intermediary? Who is releasing that code, or who is kind of the intermediary that we can actually effectively, maybe not regulate because that's not the approach, but at least think about some baseline measures. So that what's happening in security. And yes, GitHub has a really good, you know, underlying security code solution that at least allows folks to, as they're supplied for free, right? As they're using GitHub and releasing, you know, their repos, to have some foundational security measures at place. I think we hope to see something similar in AI, just in terms of a culture. And I'm personally excited to see the opportunity that, you know, we talked about policy being always beyond innovation. In my role, actually, policies create opportunities for innovation because there are new requirements and we need to find better solutions to address them. So there's also an opportunity here as well.
Well, we would anticipate a lot of changes in supply chain from these types of rules. Is it more of an opportunity or a risk for SMEs in terms of are there ways for them to exploit and gain for supply chain, or is it harder for a smaller company to pivot?
Yeah, I think it depends. So I think for the supply chain, there are challenges and also opportunities for startups. The challenges could be restricted component sourcing, the regulations that prohibit startups from using foreign-made infrastructure, such as the Huawei ban in 5G networks. and also government procurement rules. So in order to do business with the government, you have to follow a lot of the strict compliance standards. There's also talent restrictions on STEM and cybersecurity talent, which can make it difficult for startups to hire the talent they need to build their companies. And also disruption in global supply chains that will increase costs and make sourcing really difficult for companies. But on the flip side, right, as was just mentioned, every time you have a regulation, that's opportunity. Like a unicorn will be made from every major regulation that's out there. So there are a lot of potential there. And some of the positive things we're seeing coming out of some of these regulations is that for a lot of companies, there are increased opportunities for federal government and grants and contracts. The SBIR, DARPA funding, Department of Defense, DOE, they spend a lot of capital unleashed in the past few years towards startups working in AI, quantum computing, and things that could help with defense, with military. So there's a lot of potential. I see a lot of increase in public-private partnerships. So government agencies such as the Department of Homeland Security, National Security Agency, they now are working together with startups to develop the cutting-edge technologies that they need. AFRIX is another one through the Air Force. Some of them even have investment arms that they can invest in you. And so I think that is kind of unleashing new waves of innovation, knowing that you do have to follow by the national security regulations on not, kind of being careful about where you source your components, who you do business with, and who your partners are.
So, Joe, you mentioned sort of the elephant in the room, which is the potential impact of tariffs. So, as I'm sure you all know, the new administration is considering tariffs of 25% and up on everything that gets imported into the United States. And naturally, allies are not going to take that sitting down. You see what's going on in Canada right now, both, domestically a Buy Canada movement, but also retaliatory tariffs coming back in place from Canada. And I think that's something that's very likely to see from many actors, especially since we went through this 8 years ago. I'm curious if any of the folks in your network are preparing for tariffs or how you see tarification impacting your business.
Every business leader I've spoken to, is already raising prices. And so people just buckle up for inflation. It's already coming. The on again, off again, on again, off again now is kind of irrelevant because you have to prepare for it to happen, which means you have to raise prices. Because you can't be caught flat-footed. So if you order a bunch of stuff and then, you can't reorder more because you didn't charge enough because now the price has gone up. So you sold this stuff and now it's 25% more to buy it and you didn't have a big enough margin to buy your next shipment, then you got a business. So everyone's just raising their prices already. So y'all need to be ready to pay 10 to 15% more for everything you buy this year at a minimum, and for some things more. If you're getting Canadian lumber, prepare to spend a lot more to buy a house, right? And those prices are already changing because the producers have to do it. Global supply chains are longer than 30, 45 days. And so you just have to assume the tariff is coming and price accordingly. And so that's already kind of set at this point. So buckle up for inflation, everyone. Hate to break it to you, but they call them economic laws for a reason. They're not economic suggestions. And this is happening.
I think there's something else for companies to think about, which is how retaliation might affect you. So it's not just, the EU. So tomorrow there's new tariffs on steel and aluminum, right? And that'll certainly, if you're making a widget out of steel or aluminum, that will affect you domestically. But chances are the European Union is going to be imposing tariffs back on U.S. products. And that might be on your friend the farmer soybeans. That might be, on electronic products. And at 8 years ago, a lot of countries pivoted their trade laws to be more flexible in how to respond to this sort of economic coercion. And so there's all sorts of things on the table now that weren't 8 years ago, including intellectual property rights, trade in digital services. So it's possible that we see a trade war play out in a different way this time than we have in the past. And it's something for you to be aware of and think about as you do your business plans moving forward.
If I could jump in, tariffs are kind of designed to protect or encourage domestic production. But what we're going to see this time around is people localizing supply chains. Like we already have an office in Europe and we have people there. And so that group will be delivering in Europe, right? And we'll probably staff up there for demand rather than staff up here. And it's a service. We could hire people anywhere, but we're going to end up having to hire people there to avoid tariffs. And so this could backfire pretty spectacularly because the United States, most of our economy is a service economy, and services can be offshored faster. Whereas the manufacturing side, where we are more deficient, takes a very long time to build. And we may be hurting a lot more in the short run than we gain.
Indeed. I want to pivot for a minute to the impact of these regulations on hiring and investment, because a lot of the rules actually would restrict your ability to have certain nationalities, citizens of certain countries work on certain types of products. And there's certainly a lot of investment rules. I'll throw this open to anyone who has a thought about it.
I for a long time, I've advocated for reciprocity with tariffs. And so if we're going to do reciprocity, I'm very supportive. It has made no sense whatsoever for the type of tariff barriers you see in Europe versus importing cars to the U.S. so cheaply. Like, that just didn't make sense. And so if we want to talk about reciprocity, great. I'm all for reciprocity because then you're just putting people on an equal footing. And so when it comes to tariffs, reciprocity really is the way to go, because then you have a framework for the two countries to sit down and say, okay, you're taxing us at 12, we're taxing you at 12, you have this non-tariff barrier, so we created one too. What can we do to lower this, right?
We did all that 25 years ago.
We did as the WTO, which is the same mechanism that now allows us all to jack our rates up, right? It's a double-edged sword if you want to break the rules, so to speak, right? But it also makes it easier for us to bring them down, where it took a Herculean effort 25 years ago to make this happen. Now it'll be easy for us to go back down. And so, yeah, it is quick up. It'll also be quick down.
I won't, I'm very tempted to get into a tariff debate with you about the European auto tariffs, which are really just about 2%. But Wei, I did want to ask you, because you had some thoughts the other day about how these rules, affect investment, in particular capitalization and hiring, the ability to hire as you want.
Yeah, so as mentioned, it's much more difficult, right, to get investment from overseas. There's a lot of scrutiny. A lot of investors don't want to deal with that risk. And so I suggest we follow something called kind of the trusted foreign investors, where those would be conducted under stricter compliance rules, rather than just outright banning them from investing in companies. And I would suggest that low-risk foreign investments are helpful. So I suggest taking a risk-based approach based on what you're investing in, who these partners are. For example, the U.S. arms of major institutional investors in China could be, part of that trusted foreign investors list, just to make it easier to move capital. I've seen you mentioned like the access to talent and is key. I suggest something like a startup visa. There's been a lot of movements about, I know some universities are working on this. Universities can hire unlimited H-1B visas for 1 year, provided you spend, I forgot the percentage.
I think there is a lot of, we definitely need to be minded about immigration reform, especially at this time. I know this is a focus area, but the reality of the startup culture of the United States is this is the land of opportunity, and folks like me and others, they come here. And I just hope that while we're figuring all these big ticket items, we also consider the innovation element here, because I think it's central for American success.
I think an important takeaway from this conversation is that all of us need to be more involved in the policy process. So being based in Washington, where, I'm very immersed in it, and you get the updates and you file comments and you go to lunch or coffee, that's all you talk about. But when you're an entrepreneur and you are the export department, you probably don't have time to get into the weeds on policy issues. You're working on some solutions for that. What do you suggest?
Yeah, not to oversell ourselves here, but this panel right now is really special for me, because I shared yesterday that I came to South by the first time because of the EU. I spoke here 2 years ago, and it was towards my last days in Intel, and I was starting to think about my new idea. And South by was, I met here some people, and they were very instrumental in my own journey on deciding to actually create the company. And then, last year as well, we collaborated. So first of all, thank you, because you were part of my own personal entrepreneur journey. So at the really high level, the bottom line is, if you're not thinking about policy as something that is a business development tool that is critical to your product, your technology, and your market, you are missing perhaps one of the most critical uncertainties and very important pieces of the puzzle. We all know folks use Gartner, folks look at the TAM, VCs look at the TAM, companies look at what is customer demand. So for the first time in, I believe, ever, today we have generative AI. And we are able today to actually take all this text, take everything that is coming, infuse the policy expertise, and allow unicorns and entrepreneurial companies to be part of that conversation, not just to see what's coming, understand product development opportunities connected to their marketing, understand their customer base better, and also influence, which is part of what we also scale on the platform. So I can go with 2 more details later if anyone is interested, that we are fortunate to work with some of the best unicorns in the world. And if you have if you're an entrepreneur, you're here, or you're a VC and you're here, I would just say policy matters. In fact, you can't afford to ignore it anymore. And by the way, there are solutions. So, I really am encouraged to see more and more interest in policy. And I do feel like this is not an area that is worth ignoring if you're an entrepreneur.
They know what these big companies think, how it will impact them. Startups are very rarely as part of that conversation, mainly because you don't have the time. Like, startup founders only have time for 3 things, right?
Fonity was a government affairs agent, right?
Yes. So you don't have time, and the laws are very complex. They have those acronyms for everything. You have to they make it very complicated. They want you to submit comment letters, which is usually long, like 5+ pages, lots of technical terms. Like, you don't have time for that. You don't even have time to sleep or eat or, to function. And so I suggest reach out to organizations. My organization is one of them, Global Innovation Forum. We really focus on connecting you with policymakers through events, discussions, reports. We do organize some lobby days with Congress as well. There's also other really great organizations, Engine, CTA, Consumer Technology Association, Event CES. They also have an advocacy arm, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So there are pockets of organizations and people whose job is to make it easier for you to understand how policy affects your company and what can you do to advocate for yourself. And I will say, government people love to hear from startups and entrepreneurs. It's just breath of fresh air, new perspective, new energy, because it's so rare when you're always meeting with large, government affairs, lobbyists, lawyers. It's hear directly from you. And so we help facilitate that.
I'll say one thing. If you are a small business or a startup, raise your hand. Or how many of you are here? Oh, there's a bunch of you. Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you have been actively working with the Foreign Commercial Service? Lower your hands. If you haven't worked with them and written a check to them, raise your hand. So you're all working with the Foreign Commercial Service? Or none of you are? None of you are. Okay. The best kept secret in the United States is that the State Department and the Department of Commerce have this joint thing called the Foreign Commercial Service. And it's literally tens of thousands of people in embassies and consulates all over the world, and their job is to find your foreign customers. Their job is to advocate in Congress, letting Congress know how much money you are making selling stuff in these other countries. Okay? So let's say you get a chunk of the ridiculous amount of money the EU is about to spend on defense spending, for example. If you're working with them, and by the way, if you're a tiny company, it's cheap. For $5,000, they'll go find you millions of dollars of revenue in any country in the world, right? They don't even charge you very much for this. And they literally, they have the whole embassy contact list. They'll call all the people, the players. They'll call it the C-level. And I'll be like, hey, this U.S. startup has this. You interested? And they'll do all of the business development work. Then you fly over there, and they'll give you 30 meetings with people who are ready to buy. So if you're not doing this, it's probably because you don't know about it. It's cheaper than hiring a salesperson. So you should all, and they have an office here in Austin. They have an office here. You don't have to go very far, okay? They have an office in Houston. They have an office in Dallas. You should be using them. And if you do, you'll get more foreign sales, and you'll understand why the stuff we're talking about really matters.
And I will just say, from our perspective, because we are also a platform and, a technology company, there is so much that comes from policy that is not even influence and intelligence is important, but just think about your go-to market, right? So, it is a really valuable thing to be more engaged in this conversation, and not just if you're a nonprofit, when you're for profit. So, and maybe last plug for the EU for, I do feel like, you're doing this, you're here, you're in South by, you're raising awareness. And I do feel like for the public policymaker side, we've been advocating for this. We've been advocating for getting more these perspectives. And it's not just going to be people that are expected to walk into DC, into Congress. We are not in the police days in terms of room. We need to bring policymakers and leaders to innovators because they're here coding. They're here with their customers. They're not necessarily in DC. So technology-based solutions can really help democratize, right? So you're no longer, needed, right, to just be in person in those conversations.
Joe, I'm really glad you brought that up because I do think that that thinking with the European voice, I'm a little jealous of it. It's an excellent program. We have some of our own. So if you are based in the EU, happy to tell you about those later. But it is an extraordinary program, and you're paying for it already with your tax dollars. So go for it. Since there are a lot of founders in there, I'm going to encourage you to think of some questions while I asked my last question, and we'll go because you have a lot of expertise up here. What might the effect be on allies outside of the commercial relationship if we continue to diverge?
If U.S. policy continues like a policy of isolationism,
Yes. What's commercial policy?
right? Like Russia fights alone, China fights alone, America fights with its friends. Colin Powell, his whole life's work was the Powell Doctrine, right? And the Powell Doctrine is amazing. You should all go and look it up and study it. The people who disagreed with him and thought the Powell Doctrine was ridiculous were the people who brought us Iraq and Afghanistan. And look how wrong they were about every assumption they made. And so if we continue to pursue a policy of isolationism, we're walking away from all of our friends going into a fight. And that's silly. We got all these great friends who are rock stars, and we had this universe of the most fit fighters in the world. Why don't we want them to be our friends? Because Xi Jinping and Putin are lifting weights and taking protein shakes, and they're coming for us, right? So why would we do that?
I will say that the EU, the transatlantic commercial relationship is extraordinary. It's $1.7 trillion a year. It's $2 million a minute. It is an extraordinarily huge and long-standing relationship. But as founders, as companies, the most important thing is stability and predictability. And when you take that away, it makes it very difficult to continue on the current path. If anyone has a question or a comment that they'd like to make, I'd love to hear it. Yes, ma'am.
So, thank you for this, very informative. So, my husband has a company that does some business in Saudi Arabia, the traffic control systems, and he contacted the State Department about getting help marketing, and they referred him to a lobbying firm in New York, which said, we will lobby for $40,000 a month for you.
That's illegal. They cannot refer you to a lobbying firm in New York. Call the Foreign Commercial Service.
And you can get that on Google?
Yeah. It's part of the Commerce Department, and they have offices all over the United States.
So when the State Department refers you to a private provider of a service, that's illegal. Whoever did that broke the law.
Welcome to America Today. Herbie almost here.
Not quite yet.
So my question, for back summary cybersecurity, my question is, I just can't understand the irony around everyone worrying about supply chain and where they're building older technology, where they're all writing all this code on computers made in China. So I just don't understand, how far down the supply chain are we willing to go to stop this code being created?
You ever want to have a little fun around that question? Google Chinese microprocessors embedded in cords and cables.
that. That's what I'm worried about. Sorry.
Oh no, it's everywhere.
Because we sell suppliers provided cubics that plug into the switches and routers.
Yeah, the internet. Something like 85% of the cables coming out of China now has some chip hidden in them.
Yeah.
Right? So tell yourself, why would a country go to that much trouble if they did not mean to harm us? Right? So you got to be careful with Chinese supply chain.
That's what I was getting at. See, from an economic perspective, we charge from our customers to buy it from the company directly. It's $1,000, but we could go on Amazon and buy $20. And the whole time I've been sitting there wondering, like, what are they putting in those chips? That is $20.
So I think one thing to understand is the concept of risk mitigation. Okay. So when I talked about using other security requirements as a mitigation, that's a huge strategy on how we look at cybersecurity policy. So, for example, you could have certain cables, certain network infrastructure, certain infrastructure of the DoD. Like we have specific sections where there we would go to the entire supply chain and have things like Section 8 and 9 that don't allow anything. However, across all of the infrastructure, there are a lot of approaches to just say, listen, there are going to be vulnerabilities in the stack. Some of them intentional, some of them coming potentially from components. Some of them might be just open source vulnerabilities like Log4j, or that was a good example. So what we're seeing today is this movement we call it the cybersecurity zero trust, but what it is actually is applying security measures and requirements across the board. So, hey, you're requiring folks to have secure by design. And that actually is not just an abstract concept, but rather having multi-factor authentication or forcing manufacturers to patch and forcing manufacturers to work with white hat hackers or friendly hackers, right? So all these different mitigating measures need to work together, in my view, to help us make sure that we focus, to your point, like we cannot go across the stack with a hammer everywhere. We have to reserve the hammer for the top thing and usually use the scalpel. But the good news is with cybersecurity and with AI, with innovation, and with the amazing technology that we have here, by the way, a lot of it developed here in the US, but also in Israel, right? So there is an opportunity working with allies. We actually have an event on this tomorrow. Quick plug, look at my LinkedIn if you want to check that out. The good news is there are opportunities to mitigate risk across different areas of the stack, because what you just said, you're right. It's not pragmatic to say, oh, we won't have all Chinese components everywhere. Just not going to happen.
Research. So sort of followed that question. Also a cybersecurity professional or enthusiast here. We met a lot of people this week who are doing government stock and interested in CMMC at FedRAMP. But on the commercial side, it seems like SOC 2 and to a lesser extent the ISO 27001 certifications are kind of a de facto standard for critical risk management. Do you guys think those are satisfactory? And I'll just add one point here about sometimes size age appropriate, either too small or too sensitive.
Yeah, so I mean, very quickly, because I don't want to bore the audience with technical details, but most folks tell you, oh, I actually ask like entrepreneurs, like, how are you selling? What's your number one regulatory driver? Why is the CISO, the security professional, buying? And usually they would say, sometimes I get GDPR, which I find very interesting because you're kind of in the past. And often I would say, oh, we don't really, sell for compliance SOC 2. The reality is there are 50 different policies, sectorals and others, CCPA, Cyber Incident Reporting Act, Cyber Resilience Act, NIS2, FedRAMP, like a whole set of these categories that might apply to the reason the CISO is buying you. So I think we are at a shifting point. In the next year, we are going to see more security regulation implementation that we have ever seen before. We have a federal law being implemented on reporting for the first time in the US. We have two major, one is a directive, one is a regulation in the EU. So just like prepare. If you're a cyber company, compliance is your best friend right now. I mean, of course, we're striving for more, but that's going to be driving across the board. And I do agree. I feel for the dip, like for defense, small businesses, because CNMC is a lot. The opportunity there is we have security to streamline compliance now. So you have technology is going to really help. So I think it's nuanced. I think we're going to continue to evolve in security. But again, my top line to everyone here is if you're a security company and you're selling cybersecurity solution, all these type of policies are really important for your business. And I'm happy to chat more later.
Which only $18 trillion But what is that $13 trillion? It's just a piece of paper with Greek ink on it that went outside the country and brought in cars, computers, t-shirts, my socks, whatever. So what will happen when all of a sudden the U.S. is singled out as another reliable trading partner and they don't trade in dollars anymore? Then we'll
I think there's a few things you're conflating there. You're talking about the trade deficit plus the U.S. debt, which are two different things. And you're talking about de-dollarization, which is a fantasy, okay, that people talk about, because the sheer volume of how the dollar dominates global trade is utterly ridiculous, right? And people talk about it a lot. I don't know if anyone truly wants it. I've been in the back room in the discussions at the senior most levels about de-dollarization. The people who are most loud about it, they don't even want it, okay? That's appeasing their base in those countries. The dollar makes it so easy to do trade. That's what people like about it. It just makes it easy to do trade. And that lower transaction cost is ultimately what people want. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. When you're talking about the U.S. deficit, that's a very serious problem because it's basically us telling our kids and grandkids that they get to consume less so we can get something today we don't want to pay for. And I think there's something ultimately immoral about doing that. The U.S. trade deficit, that's a completely different issue. And the U.S. trade deficit has a lot more to do with two things. One is currency manipulation by net exporters, China being the worst offender. And I think that's a big chunk of it, right? The other thing was that for the longest time, the United States couldn't export oil. And that really hurt the United States. And that was a law that was put into effect in the 1970s, and it wasn't repealed until the end of the Obama administration. With that coming off the books and the U.S. exporting oil, that's helped us a lot.
We're big fans of Texas LNG in Europe.
Oh, yeah. And please, take more. We'll give you as much as you want.
As many ships as you can stuff full of LNG.
We'll shove it over there as fast as we can. And so it's important that we don't mix these three issues up because there's different things that drive all of them and they get confused a lot. And so you got to understand that, one is a decision being made by the U.S. Congress to make our kids pay for stuff we want. The other is currency manipulation by a major exporter, doing it, quite frankly, very in a predatory way that hurts the EU and the U.S. And it hurts like poor countries the most, because if you're Latin America and you're trying to build a factory, you have to compete against China, who's going to basically compete for the same U.S. customer in a dirty way. And it's if this has hurt anyone, it's hurt Latin American and African development horrifically, and those countries got to wake up to that.
I will say, just as an asterisk, the U.S. always looks into Chinese currency manipulation and has never actually found reason to trigger any of the many laws having to do with manipulation. I'm also going to say that
currency controls aren't manipulation. That's news to me.
Talk to the Treasury Department. You had a question, right?
You did, yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry. I'd like to take you back to the digital sphere, actually, if that's all right. One of the things that are going to become quite important is the intersection of trade and the topic of digital sovereignty into the European Union. And I'd like to have your opinion on where this is going to go in terms of, the European cloud certification scheme that's still under discussion, and in terms of things like the GDPR adequacy decision, which is probably going to be renewed.
Well, you lost a lot. I could start. I think the EU is like 80% there when it comes to technology regulation, because one of the advantages of having a technocracy, if you will, in Brussels is people tend to get positions because they know what they're talking about rather than getting elected. It's kind of one of the interesting advantages the EU has under its current structure. There's some disadvantages for sure, but they tend to get more experts in those positions, right? And the rotating nature of them ensure turnover and more expertise. And so I think that Europe is trying to approach this in a thoughtful way. We'll wait and see where it lands, but I think there's a lot of common sense behind the things they're discussing, and they're trying to understand the issues before they make a decision. GDPR actually, at the time it was implemented, was very smart for its purpose and it accomplished that. We just have to see what comes next.
Yeah, so from my vantage point, I totally agree. I also think it's very interesting to see the connection between standards. So in Europe, standards can have the impact of a law explicitly, not just indirectly, and they're actually the vehicle to implement the regulations, which are already very technical. If you looked at the EU Act or the EU Cybersecurity Resilience Act, no, I think we're going to see even more. EUCC is a good example. Even more sovereignty, in terms of wanting their own technical stack, cloud, etc. Especially with this, in this climate, you feel that again, if you're a company that is either looking to comply or sell solutions, that's an opportunity. Guess what? There are a lot of major cloud providers with a cloud sovereign offering. They figured out that, hey, if I need to isolate my cloud because of security solutions, it allows us to sell confidential compute solutions. So it's interesting to see how it evolves. It's definitely something you don't want to be aware of because it's either creating a risk or opportunity for you. So that's one of my takeaways.
So in the last few minutes, and I'm looking to see if my colleague from Connect is here. She might yell at me, but I think the EU takes its approach to digital sovereignty very seriously because of being in the shadow of the U.S. behemoths, right? And I often get, scolded by folks in Washington of you're coming after U.S. tech companies. We're not going after U.S. tech companies. We're protecting the digital market and the values inherent in Europe. And in a ways that actually it can be very beneficial to startups and smaller companies. Like, I don't care who comes in to replace the, company with 40% market share. I don't care if it's a U.S. small company or a Hungarian small company. We just want more diversity in offerings in the digital market space. And we want to make sure that we protect our citizens from disinformation. And that's going to be a key and critical component of EU digital policy going forward, particularly as we start hitting election seasons again in Europe. It's going to be extremely important to make sure that information online is accurate and that we're protecting our digital sovereignty and our marketplaces. Lauren's given me the nod, so I think that might mean that our time has come to an end. Is the emphatic looking at the watch. I want to thank you all very much. If anyone wants to continue the conversation, is there a bar upstairs?
There is, and everyone is welcome to enjoy coffee in the EU Coffee Corner and continue and chat with our wonderful experts. A big thank you to everyone, and Joe Merrill, who's based in Texas, here with Opus Cheese.
Oh, Texas.
Ở đây thì mình ý lại Texas.